Let's get biblical, biblical. We're gonna get biblical. Let's talk about the Mosaic Covenant. As we've noted, there is similarities between all covenants in the ancient Near East, so let's examine it through that medium. First, we begin with the parties. In this case, the suzerain, the powerful party, would be God, and the vassal or lower party would be the Hebrew people. Now, let's take a minute to discuss who are the Hebrews. Many scholars believe that the word Hebrew comes from an ancient word, the haberu. Haberu means something akin to a homeless or vagabond or refugee. It was used as a pejorative to describe people that didn't have their own home or kind of were stateless people or always moving around. Some have proposed that this was the words used to describe the Jewish people within Egypt, as they were a stateless people because they were not native to Egypt. In particular, this title might have continued as they walked as refugees across the desert of Sinai. Like many cultures, they take a word that has been used as a pejorative against them and use it to identify themselves as a matter of pride. So the earliest term for God's people may be the term refugee, and it would certainly stick with the Hebrew people, as a huge amount of biblical characters were in fact refugees.
Heroes of the faith, such as Abraham, Moses, the Israelites, Ruth, Daniel, Esther, and even Jesus Christ himself, were either refugees or victims of forced migration.
Now, when the ancients used the term haberu, they were not specifically speaking of Hebrew people, but a generic term for people who were vagabonds, homeless, or refugees. So, haberu were not the Hebrews, but the Hebrews were a type of haberu. Now, let's expand that thinking a little bit. We see various examples in the scriptures of God making allowances and commandments for foreigners living among the Hebrew people.
A foreigner residing among you who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover must have all the males in his household circumcised, that he may take part like one born in the land. No uncircumcised male may eat it. The same law applies to both the native-born and the foreigner.
This would be particularly interesting, as the Hebrew people did not have a land or national identity at this point, so it could be quite likely that people who were not descendants of Abraham actually joined the Hebrew people at this time, became part of the haberu. So the Mosaic Covenant included all the haberu or Hebrew people, which would have included descendants of Abraham and possibly other foreigners. It's not unlikely that there were other races of people who were slaves in Egypt at this time and left with the Hebrew people to escape slavery in Egypt, making it very possible that the original group of Hebrews to leave during the Exodus and arrive in the Promised Land were not all genetically descendants of Abraham, but a genetic variety of people who have made the conscious effort to follow the God of Abraham. So the Mosaic Covenant is a covenant between God and the Hebrew people, which included people that were likely not descendants of Abraham. The stipulations for the Mosaic Covenant was obedience to the Ten Commandments.
I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me.
The very fact that God gives these commandments, almost written in his own hand, to Moses, very much in covenant style, would give the impression that God was using these commandments as the ultimate covenant between him and the Hebrew people. We note that the two tablets was not 5 commandments on one and 5 commandments on the other, but the same commandments on both sides, as both parties would have been given a copy of the covenant. It is very likely that the entirety of the Mosaic law was included as a stipulation within the covenant, but the 10 commandments seem to be the foundation of this covenant. Let's take a little sidebar to ask a difficult question. Are the Mosaic commandments overly harsh? A cursory reading of the law of Moses can be a very difficult process because we see very severe penalties for what to us may seem like relatively minor crimes.
6 days shall work be done, but on the 7th there shall be to you a holy day, a Sabbath of rest of work. Whoever doeth work therein shall be put to death. She shall be brought to the door of her father's house, and there the men of the town shall stone her to death. If a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman must die. If a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death.
So this brings up the question, are the commandments of Moses overly harsh? Now, the first point to make on this is that the law codes, barring the Ten Commandments, are not a comprehensive legal code. They're more likely a collection of legal decisions that were made by the Hebraic community at this time collected together. They're not written in such a way as they are supposed to be the precise moral commandments by which everyone's supposed to live their lives. But let's take our minds out of our abundant Western setting and let's reimagine the situation. For a minute, imagine that you are in charge of a post-apocalyptic community. All of the modern wonders such as medicine, communication, welfare, fertilizer, pest control have all been destroyed. And you're in charge of a community of thousands of people. And even though you have to work insane hours, you're generally going to produce just a little bit less food than what you need to feed everyone. Imagine yourself living in this community and start to ask yourself some very difficult questions. What would your rules be about sex? Could people have sex as much as they wanted? Bearing in mind you don't have any birth control. Let's say there was a woman who was getting pregnant quite frequently and didn't have a male in her life to help her take care of the kids. That means the rest of the community is going to have to take time out of their sustenance work to provide for this woman while she's not working. Now you have to deal with these kids. You have two options. You could provide welfare for them and have everyone else work a little extra to provide for this family that keeps having kids. Or you could take time out of your incredibly busy schedule to invest in these kids and, give them an education so they can be productive. But bearing in mind, education is an extremely expensive task. You pour tons of time and resources into children, and they're probably not going to give you anything back. Throughout the vast majority of human history, people have not been able to afford education, and it was the job of both parents to provide enough assistance so the children could then be self-sustaining people in the future.
Or the child could be left to their own devices knowing that they would go to a destitute life or a life of crime.
Yet if people are having sex and they're not married and they're not forming family units, we're continually going to have a growing number of children that will not have that structure to help them be self-sustaining and become a continued drag on an already stretched thin community. Could someone be homosexual? If someone's homosexual, what happens to them when they get older? They won't have children to provide for them, and as they get older, that means other people who already have a lot of work to do are going to have to work extra to provide for people that didn't create children that could care for them in their old age. Being in charge of this community, knowing that your survival hang on a razor's edge every single day, knowing that if people made poor choices in this community, one or two bad choices could lead to the deaths of various other people from starvation. What kind of laws would you make? Would you make harsh laws with respect to sexuality? Would you make harsh laws about how people have to work? Would you make harsh laws about someone damaging another person's property? In the modern age, we live in such ridiculous abundance that if someone has damage to their property or there are children out there that don't have someone to take care of them, we use our terrific abundance to sustain these things for the rest of the community. But we can only do that because we have so much stuff. This is not the situation for the rest of the world, and certainly was not the situation for the vagabond refugees walking through the Sinai deserts. If the laws were more charitable and understanding, would it have been possible for this group of people to survive the incredibly difficult environment of living as refugees thousands of years ago? Are the commandments overly harsh, or do they just reflect life in a very difficult environment? What's the answer? You decide. Now let's look at the blessing. God is creating a holy people and a kingdom of priests. This establishment of a moral law that reflects the character of God is unique in human history. This is the creation of the wonderful idea known as ethical monotheism.
Ethical monotheism is the belief in one God who is the only source of all ethical standards.
Throughout all of human history, laws have generally been there to defend the powerful in society. And laws would change based on whatever person was in power. And if you wanted people to be more violent, you would just create a god of war that everyone had to worship, and that became the new law. If you wanted people to be more sensuous, you created a god of sex and created laws that would satisfy this new goddess. Have a money god, have a farming god, have a hunting god, have a god of wine. Most societies had an ever-changing view of what morality went that varied by generation and who was in charge. But this movement created by Moses is ethical monotheism. Ethical monotheism teaches that there is only one God, therefore there is only one source of right and wrong. And that source of right and wrong does not change depending on who's in power or the whims of the day. When you have many gods and many rulers, you can have many sources of morality. But ethical monotheism teaches there is a morality that supersedes belief centers in that day, and it is based on the ideas of one God, one source of right and wrong. This is why the Mosaic laws were absolutely revolutionary. They assumed the innate value of every single human being. While we might look at a law like an eye for an eye as being overly harsh, the reality is it was an incredibly revolutionary statement. In any society at that time, an eye of a slave was not the same value as the eye of a king. A king could remove a slave's eye just at a whim. That was absolutely fine. But when God said an eye for an eye, he was basically saying every single human being has innate imago Dei value. This revolutionary moment of ethical realization is based on there being one God, one humanity, and one source of right and wrong. Woo! What a crazy idea!
But what a beautiful idea. A solid system of right or wrong based on goodness of God revolutionized the world. Unlike other covenants, the Mosaic Covenant does not have a direct curse for violating the Mosaic Covenant. Rather, there are individual curses that are given with respect to individual violations. If you violate X law, you will receive Y punishments. This is a more nuanced approach that recognizes there could be violations of parts of the Mosaic Covenant without a total violation of the covenant made with God. And the sign given for this covenant was the Sabbath. This is also a radically revolutionary idea. Through the vast majority of human history, other people have been property of powerful lords. If you were born a couple of thousand years ago, in all likelihood, you would have been seen as the possession of someone far more powerful than you. And as a possession, you are merely a tool to advance the wealth and stability of this powerful person. And tools don't get to take breaks. The Sabbath points to the natural dignity of all human beings by recognizing that they are not tools. We were not built to just work incessantly until we die. But part of the human experience is a moment to pause, to appreciate life, to glorify God, and enjoy the wonderful things around us. The violation of the Sabbath comes with some of the most intense punishments in all of the Torah. Yet, when we look at this with respect to the reality that most human beings have lived lives of dismal servitude without any recognition of their humanity, we need to think again. Powerful people have come upon every society and human history and worked those less powerful to death. Robbing human beings of their natural dignity in the pursuit of profit is wrong. It is evil, and it has been done again and again and again throughout history. This radical statement of your natural dignity is found in the Sabbath and is central to ethical monotheism. And it is the sign for us to take on board and remember the covenant we have with God. Like the other covenants in the Torah, the Mosaic Covenant invites us back to Eden. Just as Noah was saved from the waters by the ark, Moses was saved by being placed in an own little ark or basket as he was placed down the river. Just as God separates the dry land from the water in the creation account, and with Noah, we see that Moses separates the waters of the Red Sea to create dry land for safety and salvation for his people. We also see in the Edenic covenant that God makes human beings as his image, as his symbol. They were meant to represent him in his temple, which was the earth. In the Mosaic covenant, we are defined as a kingdom of priests, stepping into this Edenic role where we are the kings and priests over God's creation and temple. This is why Moses reacts so violently to the creation of idols in the golden calf among the Hebrew people.
It is robbing them of their Edenic identity, where they are the very image of God, and substituting it for a gross bastardization of God's image. We also see when Moses builds the temple, he builds it in a manner that kind of reflects the Garden of Eden. In the center is the Holy of Holies, which was the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden itself represents the holy place, which was the closer place to God. The land of Eden represents the courtyard of the temple, where you could come a bit closer to God. The wilderness into which Adam and Eve were expelled represents being outside of the Hebraic community, being cast off from the people. The Moses Covenant calls people back to Eden. It points back to the Garden of Eden as the place we are supposed to get to and will move toward through keeping the Mosaic Covenant. Finally, Pharaoh seems to take on the identity of the serpent in the Garden of Eden. As we noted that there was a lot of flying snake motifs in Egypt, and the Pharaoh often associated himself with the snake. The Bible defines both the serpent and Pharaoh as shrewd. And the Pharaoh reacts very aggressively when he sees that the Hebrew people living in Egypt were becoming fruitful and multiplying. Because they were living out the Edenic blessing in that place, the Pharaoh almost takes upon himself the spirit of the serpent and wants to crush them from experiencing the Edenic blessing. We also note that Moses' first miracle in front of Pharaoh was the creation of a snake, and then Pharaoh's people kind of creating their own snake, but yet Moses' snake devours the Pharaoh-produced snake. Once again, this covenant story brings us back to Eden. The Mosaic Covenant is one of the most complicated yet historically significant covenants in human history. While we have to recognize the cultural elements that exist within it, we can find that the heart behind it in God is for us to live ethical lives considering others under the single authority of one holy God.